Welcome to the SumerSports Show. Lindsay, Rhodes, and Sam Bruchhaus with you, continuing our Sticky Stats series. We're talking about wide receivers today. It's our third position group that we have tried to attack in this series. We talked about quarterbacks and running backs already. You can find those shows elsewhere on our feeds, YouTube, SumerSports, under the live button, or in the podcast feed, wherever you get your podcasts. We talked about running back last week. And as we acknowledged then, that is by far the toughest position to attack in this way, to nail down statistically, as those stats tend to be pretty hard to separate from their environment. Sam, wide receiver, much easier in that regard. We feel a lot more confident that we can point to a few stat groups that have proved to be predictive for the position.
Yeah, if running back is that cutscene in Willy Wonka and the Chocolate Factory with Johnny Depp where he's like carving his way through the jungle, this is like just a nice little cruise. Like, sure, the weather might get a little bad. You might get a little seasick depending on which player gets injured or something like that. But for the most part, a lot of these stats are actually quite sticky in a way that we really don't see with the other major fantasy position, and that's the running back position.
All right, so we need to define a few things like predictive and sticky, frankly. Like when we're talking about sticky stats and when we use the word predictive, are we talking about stats that will tell us that the player is good? Are we predicting, are these ones that like predict that the player is good or that they will produce? Because sometimes obviously these are two totally different things.
So I think to a certain degree, neither per se, as it portends to these statistics themselves, especially given that wide receivers are probably the most contained by a coaching staff and by a scheme, given the offensive line has to block, the quarterback has to receive the snap. If there's play action, the running back has to do his job, and then the quarterback has to select which wide receiver gets the ball and then delivers the pass that way. They're kind of stuck in what they have to do. So as a result, when we're talking about stickiness, we're talking about two things. Number one, how do these numbers go year over year? Like, how tightly are they going to remain the same?
Okay.
And then secondarily, in the standpoint of usage, will that player be utilized the same? And then we can build the story using multiple of them and understanding that they are a little stickier to build out whether this player could be good or should be used more or so forth and so on. But for the most part, we're just laying out kind of the base steps of where you should see these players continue to perform at the level or continue to be used at the level that they are currently.
Okay. Interesting. So I think it's good that we went through that because we're not necessarily, when we say here are the stickiest stats for wide receivers, we are not saying use these when identifying who is the best up and coming wide receiver that you should draft in fantasy. That's a great value pick for you. So we will name check as we go through the ones that do tell that story, maybe. But these are the ones that are just statistically like sticky year over year. You're probably going to see similar usage with this player, and that number might remain roughly the same. So let's start with the ones that we think are the stickiest. And I would be interested to hear what your correlation looks like because for these, because I know you were talking last week, like even the stickiest things for running backs were like very low correlation numbers. There are, let's see, what are the ones that we have here in the first category? There's three stats that fall under the definitely sticky.
Right. So when we're talking about correlation, we're talking about a number basically between 0 and 100. And if it's over 50 in football, that's like really, really good because there's so many things going on. Like if you're looking at, other industries or other things, you definitely want in the 70s or 80s in terms of the correlation to really say it's sticky. But in football, over 50 is okay. You can deal with it. There was really none that were over 50 in terms of the running backs. Like you're really gripping on anything for the 40s and 50s in terms of running backs. You're like, okay, well, I'm at least seeing a little light in the dark. It's not really the case with statistics like target share, average depth of target, and after the catch production, which is kind of very, very tied to average depth of target as well. And I think the reason that is, Lindsay, is because the coach, the quarterback, and the wide receiver all kind of have a hand in that. And it is all kind of, quote, game plan. We hear a lot of Kevin O'Connell and other coaches saying, our first option is always going to be Justin Jefferson, or our first option or our best wide receiver is going to allow other players to get involved. And that is a game plan thing that is decided on Friday and Saturday before the game. And we're talking really sticky here. ADOT is like well upwards of 50. We're talking like 70s, 80s. And it's the same thing for target share. So what's the takeaway from that? Good players earn targets. That's why it's called a target earner. And when we're talking about guys like Tedoroic McMillan or Emeka Egbuka in the first round of the draft, why we want to try to figure out if they are a target earner, because that is a sticky stat. It will continue for guys like Malik Neighbors and AJ Brown and Puka Nacua. They will continue getting targets. And that's a pretty core item to what a wide receiver wants out of his play.
Yeah. Target earner is a word that I used a lot this offseason when describing what I wanted the Packers to go get. Like what I thought their wide receiver room was missing.
Right.
Is Matthew Golden that? I don't know. But that was, they had a bunch of different guys and you never really knew which one was going to be the guy. And you need someone who's so good that he just demands the ball. Like we're always going to be looking to get him the ball in a perfect world. I.e. Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, right? Like those types of guys. So I think that totally makes sense that target share would be a storyteller. Follow up about that though. You're going to have some guys that are drafted into situations where like the Bucks are one that comes to mind for me right now, because like Emeka Egbuka, like we loved him in the draft. He goes there. I like it even strategically for the Bucks because it feels like they're planning for the future. Like they're like, okay, we got Chris Godwin now, but when Chris Godwin, who is older, is no longer here, Egbuka just steps right into the Chris Godwin role and we're set and we don't have to like chase our tail here. But he might have a very low target share at target rate at the beginning. Actually, as I'm going back to this, I'm remembering the fact that you told me that these are sticky. Well, no, even just in terms of stickiness, it feels like this is one that could change because your role in an offense could change as other people age out. So how is this one so specifically sticky?
Right. And I think those are the edge cases. And that's the 20% or 30% of the correlation that is kind of undefined. Is those guys who are down depth and end up aging into something. And I think this brings up an interesting discussion, particularly given these sticky stats and when to kind of give up on the stats or when to be uncertain about what is going on. And that is the aging curve of wide receivers. And we've done a lot of research into this. Quinn McLean, who's been on this show and is an excellent data scientist for us, sent me a bunch of notes. And he basically focused a lot of last year when we were closely looking at the draft on this topic. And here's a couple of things to note. Number one, there's a long tail on wide receivers, meaning that year one wide receivers can do well. We can see them do well. We can see Malik Neighbors lead the league in target share and have really great fantasy statistics. That's one thing to note. But that doesn't necessarily portend that that's it for them. On average, wide receivers hit their peak in, around year 4 or 5.
4 or 5.
4 or 5. That being said, and this is the third part of the aging curve, is it is kind of flat at the top. Guys who are good in their first year are typically good in their second year and good in their third year. And so it is kind of an interesting mix. And that's why when you see fifth year option pickups for wide receivers, it's kind of in the middle, because if you don't see that player play good in year 1 or year 2, you're probably not going to believe in them in year 3, because things like target share are so sticky. Things like ADOT and these usage statistics that coaches really are honing in on are so sticky. And so with guys like Egbuka, for example, or Jalen McMillan, another great example, it really comes down to depth, which is kind of an item to the side that is really well researched just in terms of passing offenses. Is you want to have a great third receiver. Mm-hmm. And so if a player is showing really great signs of production as a great third receiver, but doesn't necessarily have the target share or isn't necessarily being, the certified number 1 option, it could be an indication that by the time their 5th year option comes about, the time to decide, which is year 3, they actually may be willing to jump out, or they may be, set up to jump out in year 3 or year 4, given that's about the average of when he pops up. So a lot of information there, but the kind of 2 major things is, yes, number 1, usage is sticky. But number two, the best passing offenses have a lot of depth. And so if there's a situation in which a player moves up the depth chart in his second, third, or fourth year, that could be a very interesting spot to jump on a player.
Jalen McMillan. I'm just sticking with the Bucks coming to mind right now when you're talking about the very good wide receiver threes in those situations. A-Dot totally makes sense to me that this would be sticky in the sense that it would be consistent year to year, because usually you are a certain type of wide receiver that has a certain type of skill set and they use you in a certain type of way. Like, it's very infrequent that they're like, hey, we're going to get you the ball out of the backfield. And now next year you're going to be our deep ball threat. So that one totally makes sense to me. What about the yards after the catch?
So I think that's very tied to average depth of target as well, because obviously if you're getting the ball behind the line of scrimmage, your job is to get total yards after the catch. Whereas if you're a deep ball guy or a contested catch guy or a red zone guy, probably not, you don't really need to get a ton after the catch. So it's very, very tied into A-Dot. And the thing that exemplifies this the most is when you add in running backs and tight ends, it's still very sticky. But the running backs and tight ends typically will lead in terms of production after the catch. And the reason why that is they're involved in screens and short passes a lot. And so I think it's a little bit more of a usage stat, but where it can really be helpful is using it in the context of target share. Because let's think about a guy like Deebo Samuel, Lindsay, a fantasy relevant guy while he was in a 49ers jersey, perchance if he's moving to a new situation at the Commanders, if he probably will have a low A-Dot being involved in screens a lot, he will have a lot of production after the catch. If his target share is low in the first 3 or 4 weeks, he may not be a guy who you necessarily want to jump in on or trade for. However, if his target share is high, that could indicate that he is the engine of the offense. And given that target share, over season is quite sticky, it indicates that the offensive coordinator probably wants to use him in that way. And he may be kind of, an outlier and have a lot of short yardage production, but he'll be getting the ball a lot, which is a big key, particularly in PPR. And so using these three sticky stats together, A-Dot, the production, especially when it's short after the catch, and then the target share really can allow you to paint a really good sticky picture of a player fairly quickly.
Who's popping to me in target share that is not a name I would have expected on this list under the circumstances is Keenan Allen last year at number 10.
So I think the Bears are going to be really fascinating because they, on paper, looked like a team that had a really high level of depth on that offense. And then as kind of the season went on, we didn't really love the production of DJ Moore.
Anyone.
Didn't really love the production of Roma Tunze. Really didn't love the production of Keenan Allen either.
Oh.
And we spoke weeks ago about how we were kind of nervous about how Colson Loveland is going to come into this offense, given that they have, seeming depth, but not necessarily production. And so that's going to be a very interesting number, especially in the face of a new offense coordinator coming in, to keep an eye on is that 5 group of guys, Moore, Allen, Odunze, Kmet, and Loveland, how their target share breaks up. Because again, this is something that's going to have correlation week over week. It's going to have correlation season over season. And if you're not seeing the level of opportunity that you need to see out of any of those guys quickly, it may be a sign that it's not their fantasy year or it's not their production year when it comes down to it.
So interesting in terms of what that says about the offense, his target share being so high from an NFL standpoint, because also not to belabor this point, but yards per route run, 1.65, not good. Catch rate, 57%, not good. So anyway, that was one that just as I pulled up the list of target share, that one stuck out to me. These are decently sticky stats. So we've gone through 3 that we think are actually pretty sticky: target share, A-Dot, yards after the catch per catch. And again, just reiterating in case you're joining us late, we are saying that those are sticky in the sense that they are likely to remain consistent from a year to year to year standpoint, not sticky in the sense or predictive in the sense that this is telling us that this guy's so good because his ADOT is whatever. That's clearly not the
Yeah.
story we're telling with that. Decently sticky stats for wide receivers are.
Yeah, and I do want to note a quick caveat before I jump into these because it matters for these. We're talking about yards per route run, EPA per route run in these decently sticky stats. That means you are actually just producing. And as a result, it's a little less sticky than the ones that are saying you are actually just being used by your offensive coordinator. However, as we add in more routes and as we add in more opportunity, these do end up getting stickier. When we're talking about, just on a season by season level, looking at guys who only had 50 or 60 routes run, and then they had 50 or 60 routes run again, and then everyone that had more than that versus everyone who had 200 routes run, it gets stickier. And these, as compared to running back stats, are still wildly above. We're talking about correlations here in the, mid to low 60s, high 50s here as compared to the 40s with running backs. So these are still pretty good metrics to define how good a player might be, how productive a player might be.
Now, yards per route run in particular, before you get into any of the other ones, really does feel like it would tell that story, because this is how many times you're on the field. Out of every time you're on the field, how often do you create a situation where you are the person that the quarterback looks at and says, you're the guy I should get the ball to, and then what do you do with it, right? Like, it literally is a what do you do with your opportunities type of metric.
100%. And just eye test, you look at the names last year who were leaders, and you can check these out at SumerSports.com. We have yards per route run: Puka Nacua, Rashee Rice, AJ Brown, Nico Collins, Ladd McConkey, Justin Jefferson, Brown. Like, these are all guys who were borderline all pros or would have been all pros if they didn't get injured last year. And so this is like a good sign, especially once you start getting to volume of routes, that this player is actually just going to be productive within the context of his team. And it's great that they're decently sticky. It gives you an idea, perchance, of who may bump up a little bit to a certain degree. And then it also kind of gives us an idea of what offenses are good to a certain degree as well.
Quinn, who you mentioned earlier, mentioned that we should point out how personnel can affect this stat.
It definitely can. And so you think of the heavy 11 teams, for example, like the Los Angeles Rams, where you're getting the ball to kind of three guys in a multitude of different ways. And then the tight ends are sometimes staying in the block versus, a team that utilizes more diverse personnel, which could be doing a lot of different things. Like you look at some of the guys on the Broncos, for example, and they'll have very low yards per route run or very high, and it just kind of depends on their utilization. So you do want to kind of track it alongside with what the team is going to ask their guys to do. And that's why it's good to use these statistics with the usage stats that we discussed prior, alongside the team personnel stats as well.
EPA per route run would be a little bit different than yards per route run.
A little different. It adds a little bit more context and how the player is actually impacting the game. A little different for wide receivers because, like, most of the time they're gaining the big chunks of yards in the middle of the field. So yards actually do have quite a bit of meaning to wide receivers as compared to running backs, where 3rd and 1 is radically different to a running back than 3rd and 15, for example. And if you get 14 yards on 3rd and 15, that doesn't mean nothing. Where if you get it on 3rd and 1, it means a lot. And so it means a little bit less. And as a result, it's kind of the same, like nearly the exact same correlation between EPA per route run and yards per route run. But it does add in a little bit more information, particularly in the red zone for some of these guys.
Okay. After that, another stat that is decently sticky is what we're calling this category.
Yeah. So target rate. And so allow me to differentiate. Target share is in the context of the team. And that's why it means so much. Whereas target rate is saying this player runs a route and he's targeted at XYZ rate. And where this starts getting a little weird is for guys who are certified number one wide receivers, like Jamar Chase, for example, where you do have T. Higgins on the other side, and you might be running people off for T. Higgins, given T. Higgins is so good. And so that's why it's a little less correlative, because as kind of people come on and off the field, it may not be the exact same calculus that target share may be, but it still means a lot, because you want to understand how a quarterback in particular is looking at this guy.
Target rate might also be targets per route run. Because
Exactly.
some, people use these stats differently or name check them differently, but these are effectively
In the
same
context
stat.
of the single player. That's correct.
Mhm. Okay. What about what else? What else is in this category?
Yeah. So the final one is first downs per reception. Again, this is one very similar to EPA per route run or yards per route run, but it does give you a context of how you keep those chains moving. Nothing too crazy. It is less so because obviously once you start getting in the red zone, or once you're getting used on third down or first down, early down, late down usage, adds in a lot of context that we're not at least accounting for in this statistic, but it's very similar to those other two stats. When you put all four of these together, particularly those production stats, this is where we're starting to get an idea of how good this player is, but we're also losing a little bit of predictiveness because of that descriptive power.
Okay. So the stats in this category, to recap, we had yards per route run or EPA per route run,
Mhm.
kind of grouping them together as they're roughly the same. Targets per route run or target rate, and
Correct.
then first downs per reception.
That is
Okay.
correct.
What about some stats that are not particularly sticky, but still stickier than running backs? Wait, when you say this and you wrote this down as the
Yeah.
category, does that mean that all of these are still stickier than the stickiest stat that we highlighted for running backs?
We're starting to get in the range
Okay.
so we're starting to get in the 40s or 50s in terms of correlation. And so they're still bringing us some value. The correlation is not zero. It's not bringing us anything. They are just what I like to call overly descriptive. Like, we are adding in all the context so we can look at a play and be like, oh, I see what that player did, and then aggregate across every single play. And so, for example, catch rate on targets. A lot could go wrong on a target. It could be a bad throw for a quarterback. It could be all this stuff. But we want to understand how often the player is able to get down with the ball. That could change radically if the quarterback changes. And so that's another one. Then we look at things like our route running Sumer scores. We're digging down deep to the frame level, and we're setting cutoffs for the time the ball is thrown. So basically everything before what we would try to calculate on that catch rate. That can change based on the offense, but we're really trying to be very, very descriptive in what we're talking about here, so we can understand what the player has done at the expense, to a certain degree, of the predictiveness. And when I say at the expense, again, I want to hone in on this. Just means that it will take more routes to understand how good a player is in the totality of his career at these statistics. It'll tell us pretty well what he did on any given play. It just may not be consistent until we, have 500 routes run by a player, or 2 years, something like that. And then yards after catch over expected, which we talked about after catch production at the top being very sticky. This is adding in all that other context to understand where he's getting the ball, where people are, if the blockers are blocking correctly. And so as a result, it takes a lot more routes to get an understanding. But guess who one of the best guys in yards after the catch over expected is every year? Jamar Chase. And that is his bread and butter. And that's why he's one of the best guys. And so when you get that over 5 years, he's going to produce after the catch no matter what, as compared to, running back 2 on a team who's, getting a little throw out and has a couple of good catches in terms of yards after the catch. So these stats are adding in and measuring a lot of things. You need a lot of routes to make sure that that player actually is performing well and will continue to perform well. But they are excellent to describe what is happening on plays.
For the catch rate on targets, that one,
Mhm.
what if we just made it catch rate over expected? And we put in the expectation, it kind of accounts for like whether it was a catchable ball or. that
So
type of situation.
I think this is an interesting one, and I want to posit two players who kind of show the two sides of this. And I think it's very useful when you mix it with statistics. But when you look at like catch rate over expected, the way the technology works right now is it's dots on a map. And so we don't necessarily know if a player is going up and getting it. We don't know if he's diving down low to get it. It's just dots on a map. And that's the way the technology works right now. That's when you see the dots on the Amazon Prime broadcast, that's exactly the tracking data that we're getting. So as a result, there's some context that's left out. So on the left side, we have DK Metcalf, who, for example, seemed to be very good at the catch last year. And then on the right side, we have Quentin Johnson, who seemed to be not very good at the catch last year. And so, like DK Metcalf, similar body types, similar builds, probably similar usage as well. You look at Geno Smith, excellent completion percentage over expected. And Justin Herbert was also a very good quarterback as well. But like, should we ding Justin Herbert for that? Not really. So there is a little bit of quarterback accuracy, wide receiver catchability question mark when it comes down to that. And there's a little bit of scheme as well when you're talking about what is the catchable ball. Like, are you trying to throw him in stride? Is the wide receiver seeing something differently? There is a lot of context there, but you do want to continue to boil down and add more and more context and more features to these models to get an understanding of exactly who deserves credit for a difficult catch. Certainly.
Now I have to look for our boy Quentin to find out. So, but he's negative 3.3% catch rate over expected.
Yeah, not great.
So I would think that story kind of tells you that like that accounts for his other catch rate number should have been better because Justin was throwing him catchable balls at this
Correct.
rate that was higher. And it's
Correct.
not always the quarterback. It might be something different, right? But like,
correct. And when you look at things like tight window percentage, for example, like not a lot of separation on the catch. A guy like Ladd McConkey was very good. And so it indicates a little bit that like that actually is on Quentin. But there's surely guys as well here who, you know, the quarterback just wasn't putting it exactly where it needed to be. And maybe that they're designed, the routes were designed to be pretty difficult, and the quarterback just needs to make those. I'd be interested in like what the Colts guys would be, for example.
Okay, I'll get to that in 2 seconds. But first, since I'm at the bottom of the list, I'm going to point out some other people where it feels like the stat is telling us that they didn't do as much as was expected, you know, based on their environment. And Dontavian Wicks is negative 12.4%.
Yeah,
my guy cannot catch the ball.
I
like,
mean,
what's going on?
look,
He consistently is a guy who, like, you put in some like really hard to do things stat, like, and you're like, man, he looks so good, and then you just can't catch the ball. Like, I don't get it. I don't get it.
I mean, look, there's a reason the Packers, after all these years, drafted 2 wide receivers.
Xavier Worthy is also negative 9.6.
So I think that's an interesting one, because we had a whole discussion around the Super Bowl about how Patrick Mahomes' statistics were not as good as they were last year. And I think there were a lot of situations in which, you know, they weren't just able to link up. And so the question arises, given that we've seen Patrick Mahomes be so good on deep balls with guys like Tyreek Hill, with guys like Travis Kelce, of whether the context that we don't necessarily know, the option route stuff, the exactly where I'm supposed to be on the red line versus the numbers versus the hashes versus the sideline, whether that just wasn't in accordance or they weren't on the same page this year as compared to Xavier Worthy can't catch and as compared to Patrick Mahomes can't throw, which we know pretty well that not to be true. We know he can throw. We know he's one of the best quarterbacks of all time. So that's when you want to kind of dig a little bit deeper into what's going on, because, you know, we don't really view Xavier Worthy as a guy who can't catch, but we also don't view Mahomes as a guy who's not going to be able to make those throws.
100%. Yeah, that's really interesting. I know you wanted to know about the Colts, but when I go back to the top of the list in catch rate over expected, it's not the Colts that pop, it's the Panthers. And I wonder how much this potentially changed down the stretch, right? Like how much of this was beginning of the season. Adam Thielen, number 1 in this category at plus 12.4. he had a catch rate 12 percentage points higher than it should have been based on the balls that he was getting, according to this data. And Jalen Coker is 4th on this list with a plus 11.4.
And it's really interesting how this stat in particular, especially given it is kind of an official NFL stat, as it pertains to next gen stats. We talked about the Packers, and they seem to have made decisions based off this. We talk about the Panthers. They added a serious contest. I mean, like his Tedero McMillan's biggest pro was that he was in a terrible offense and he made Noah Fafita look like an NFL quarterback. And if that's what you want to add to Bryce Young, who notably was more accurate down the stretch last year, notably was substantially more productive when it came to the last 3 games last year, and who we started to believe in kind of mid-season when he's putting up above average games against the Chiefs and the Eagles, the 2 Super Bowl defenses, seems like an excellent investment.
Okay. I'm like digging deep. We're now on the like, these kind of matter. And I'm like digging into the names here. So sorry for picking this category, but
well, no,
sort of interesting.
It's informative because it's descriptive. And so like when it comes to a guy like Adam Thielen, who's played for years, he probably is going to add that stuff. And so you probably do. This is where you get like archetypes kind of to a certain degree. And is it hard to project into those archetypes? Yes. But if you see an archetype work with your quarterback, then you kind of want to go get that archetype. And then particularly when you notice players being really good at these statistics, over 500 routes run, over 1,000 routes run, that means they're really good.
Right.
And so you should really attack them.
Well, and so interesting point there, because what we're talking about, as we established off the top, what is a sticky stat? It's one that is likely to remain consistent year to year to year. You could see how catch rate over expected probably wouldn't, because maybe they have a quarterback who's not throwing good balls and now the expected changed. And so, or they've got a quarterback who's throwing them dimes. And so it's like catch rate over expected is 0 because like the ball is perfect and you catch it. Like you did exactly what was expected, right? So I could see how this number could change potentially. But like if you have a catch rate over expected, this really high year over year, that might tell a story of you're a good wide receiver and you're in a bad offense, or you have a quarterback who over a period of time is not throwing you consistently well-placed balls. Following up on this, and people are not going to love these names. You tell me if this matters or not. Number 5 on this list and number 6 on this list are both Eagles wide receivers. Devontae Smith is plus 11% and AJ Brown is 10.5.
So I think this is an excellent point because let's investigate. And I think wide receivers, and we've done this many times, Lindsay, especially talking about guys like DK Metcalf, is wide receivers is a fascinating view and investigation, especially when you have these advanced statistics into the quality of an offense. And so we forget about it because they won the Super Bowl. But the biggest problem with the Eagles last year was their passing offense. So if you want to pinpoint who the problem was to a certain degree, you go look at AJ Brown's advanced statistics. You go look at his Sumer score for us, or his route running Sumer score, his catch rate over expected, all these descriptive stats. He was incredible at them. And moreover, he's been incredible at them for years. And it's the same thing with Devontae Smith. Now, we talk about that third receiver problem. Dallas Goedert, very good on some of these metrics, was injured for bits and pieces of the year. Maybe they really struggled with, Jahan Dotson having to step into there. But at the same time, who are kind of the arrows pointing back to, because it ain't the offensive line, it's kind of Jalen Hurts. So the question arises for me.
Yes.
New offensive coordinator. This is what, the 4th offensive coordinator in 4 years. We've seen him struggle in different areas before. Rather ineffective during the regular season passing offense, and a game that is based off of being able to scramble, and that's what set the mark during the playoffs. So all that being said, I'm not going to bet against a team that doesn't have an excellent offensive line as the Eagles do. But if you start seeing scramble rates go down for Jalen Hurts, if you start seeing production on paper go down, but great routes run and great catch rate over expected from these players who have been doing it for a very long time, the fingers may be pointing back to the quarterback position, not necessarily to the wide receiver position.
Yeah, it might be pointing to both in this sense. Well, this stat points to both, right? It tells you Devontae Smith and AJ Brown are pretty good wide receivers.
Yep.
And it also maybe circles Jalen Hurts as like a guy who might be, I'm going to phrase this in an extreme way that people are going to hate, but like to a degree might being propped up a little bit. His stats might be being propped up a little bit by the wide receivers. Matt Stopsky, who is our producer, has been just blowing up our like private chat as we talk about this because he want to come in, Stopsky. He is a giant. He's a Giants guy. And so he's like, I hate hearing that they're good. I'm like, stop texting us about the conversation we're having and just come on. I wanted to say you don't like the Eagles having two wide receivers being very good, but this might also tell you that their quarterback is not as good as he's getting credit for. And that should maybe even this out, right? In terms of your Giant fandom sadness or happiness.
No, because have you seen how good AJ Brown and Devonta Smith is? But they're amazing. Like unless Jalen Hurts was, like Rex Grossman, I don't think it mattered. Like they are just so incredible. So I'll take the small caveat, like, you know what? Maybe they're not that great. Oh no, maybe a 12-win team instead of a 13-win team. But like for me, it doesn't matter much. Like they're still incredible.
Seriously, where's your catch rate over expected? Well, actually, it should be pretty high after last year, except that it wasn't because everything was bad. Anywho, thank you very much for joining us. So what's funny too, and this is just to consistently like look at the stat and realize the story that it's telling us. Amon-Ra St. Brown, Tim Patrick, both in the top 10 in catch rate over expected. That one's one that like, I think we would sort of expect that feels rightish, right? Like Jared Goff, I think we're pretty clear on who he is as a quarterback. Like he's a good enough quarterback, but he's not like, an elite level quarterback. And so no, what's happening here with your neck?
So I'm just thinking through with the Lions in particular, because anytime we talk about the Lions passing game, and maybe I'm a little biased because I love watching Jared Goff throw these balls, but Jared Goff is so great at those strikes over the middle.
Okay.
And so because there's so many people in the middle, but Tej Seth, Stats and Scheme podcast, also has an article on SumerSports.com talking about how the middle of the field is kind of the most efficient part of the field if you can do it. It brings about a question of like, what exactly is going into that catch rate over expected? Is Goff just very good at throwing those balls, but we have troubles when he gets outside the numbers? Is Amon-Ra St. Brown excellent at finding the zone that allows Goff to make the throw in the way that we think about Travis Kelce doing per se?
Okay, so let me just break that down real quick, because that's actually an interesting point. Yeah. The expected is not just necessarily that the ball was poorly thrown and you should and you caught it, even though you weren't expected to. Is the expected is also taking into consideration how frequently these types of throws are made, and if it is to the intermediate middle of the field and you're good in that area, then is that also being taken into account with the expected?
I think what I'm also considering is the number of players that have to be in the context frame as a result. If you're throwing over the middle, we're talking about, okay, I'm stepping back, I'm stepping into the pocket. The center, the guard, and the two tackles, in essence, are involved. The two linebackers are involved. The two safeties involved. And if it's man coverage, the corner is also involved, to where if I'm throwing a go ball way out to the right side of the field, there's probably one or two players involved totally. And so that's what I'm thinking about kind of more when I'm thinking of the expectation, is that in essence, more could go wrong because there's so many people involved. And that's like the core thing with football, right? Is like screen passes, for example, you should be completing those. So if you don't complete them, your completion percentage over expected is going to crater, despite it not really killing you in terms of EPA, because we know the screen game is very similar, kind of is considered run game extended in terms of EPA, to where like the boost from making a deeper throw, which is like you can rack up completion percentage over expected per se, in terms of EPA and things like that, is much more 4 plays over the middle, for example.
Okay. I'm gonna get way too into the weeds here for a lot of people. Sorry for that. But I feel like we need to establish the difference to a degree of where the expected is coming from when we have a conversation about completion percentage over expected, where I think I've assumed like, and I think it's true, this is a hard throw to make. This type of throw to this spot is made X percentage of time. You make it this many more percent of time, right? That's your completion percentage over expected. But it's not necessarily like your receiver, it's not like attributing anything to your receiver necessarily. Whereas the catch rate over expected, I think in my brain, I've been like, bad throw, but you caught it anyway. But is that also taking into consideration the types of things that we're looking at for completion percentage over expected, which is like this type of throw is infrequently made and you make it a lot?
So I think there's two major differences, but this is probably the hardest thing to disentangle is the quarterback making a good throw or is the receiver making a good catch?
Right.
And obviously there's some times where it's easy to entangle, where a quarterback just lofts it up and the wide receiver goes up and gets it. Throws over the middle a little harder. So typically what we're doing is at a frame by frame level, right? We millisecond by millisecond level. There's 22 guys on the field and we're evaluating all of those in the past of where those players were. And at any given point in time, we're trying to figure out, will a pass be completed? The timing is what's key here. Completion percentage over expected is once the ball leaves the quarterback's hands, his job's done. So that's typically what we're looking at when we're saying, okay, well, we thought when he released the ball that he had a 20% chance of completing this, but he completed it. So congratulations. That's your delta there. But that the receiver's job isn't done there. And so when you look later on, that's when we start thinking about catch rate over expected to a different degree. But at the same time, the point in which the catch is made is defined by the quarterback throwing the ball, how he threw the ball, the pace at which he threw the ball, the height at which he threw the ball, the place at which he threw the ball, so forth and so on. And so that's why this is so hard to disentangle. But the key difference is the timing, because when the wide receiver's job ends is a lot different than when the quarterback's job ends.
Whew. A few other stats that I think we need to bring up here that have not been mentioned so far. Quinn, who you talked about, really likes weighted opportunity rating, which is mathematically 1.5 times target share plus 0.7 air yard share. So I got to do some math to figure this out. There are some sites that have that on their site. I think maybe we could work to get on that on the SumerSports website. But so essentially this tells you what weighted opportunity share.
So this is very similar to those top tier usage stuff. So you're taking the target share, and then rather than a dot, which is only on targets, you're taking the quarterback threw the ball this far, this many times, or a team, I guess is to better stated, threw the ball this far, this many times, and the wide receiver received this many of those when he was targeted. And so
from a value standpoint, you're running a lot of downfield routes, like your air yard number is high.
Yeah.
So even if you don't have a high target share, are you a guy that stretches the field for the offense? And that's of value.
Exactly. It's combining the idea that you should be targeted a lot and you probably want to be getting a lot of yards. Or at least like the quarterback wants to get you a lot of yards. So if you have a very high target share and you're way down the field all the time, then that's interesting to note, whether than as compared to like the Debo kind of guys, or the Marvin Mims kind of guys who, aren't getting targeted a lot, but are running screens as well. Like that, it's a big difference. So it almost turns these two into a 4-quadrant thing of targeted a lot, targeted down the field, not targeted a lot, not targeted down the field, and then the blend of those two as well.
Or not targeted a lot, but when you're targeted down the field. And so you have a high value to the team. Exactly. You do that specific job well, even though it doesn't lead to a ton of targets.
Exactly.
You mentioned the years earlier, and I wanted to circle back to that because you said year 4, year 5 is when wide receivers hit their peak. we have heard a lot in the fantasy space about year 2 breakouts, and then maybe even more so year 3 breakouts. So year 2 big, year 3 maybe even bigger. So if year 4, year 5 are when we're hearing about them hitting their peak, then why is it that in those 2 years, that's where we usually see somebody take a huge jump?
So I think there's 2 parts to this, which number one is, as discussed, and as we've discussed deeply with these contexts, is that usage is so sticky. And so when we're seeing year 2 and year 3 breakouts, it may indicate, number one, that they were used a lot or not super efficient, or number 2, that they're now really efficient and aren't being used a lot. And in order to figure that out, you need to wait kind of until year 2 or year 3, right? Another key option here is year 3 is when you got to decide basically if you're going to extend someone. And so if that player does get the extension, and then all of a sudden year 4 and year 5 is their peak and they start taking a downturn. And I will note, when I'm saying peak, I mean, that's typically where we see a player do the best and then start to take a downturn to a certain degree.
Oh, that's an interesting point of that. Like peak is also the end of the good in some ways.
And so I think from a fantasy perspective and also from a team perspective, you want to see a breakout in year 2 or year 3, because then you can make a decision on them, or you can catch the alpha on them where everyone else doesn't see it. Whereas, a year 4, year 5 breakout, you're not going to have that team control over them, for example. And that's going to cause major problems for you down the way. And so thinking about the way we've talked about these statistics, if you think you have a guy who's pretty good, year 2 or year 3, you're certified going to start using them a lot more. Whereas, year 4 or year 5, if they're still on the same team, usage is probably going to be sticky, and you just won't see it happen ever again. So I think that's kind of the distribution there of like the reason why we see the year 2 and year 3 breakout is because players start being used more. Then all of a sudden we know they're good. Year 4, year 5 is their peak, and then their aging curve kind of drags them back down. Whereas, tight ends, for example, it's not necessarily the case. It's a harder position to learn. You have a much larger thing. The anecdote is that if you're drafting a tight end in the first round, you're drafting someone else's tight end, and you don't necessarily see that usage bump per se because they may be blocking a lot in year 2 or year 3.
Do you think, and I know that we have this conversation every time, but do you think that so we're talking about we look at things through a data prism.
Exactly.
And historically, specifically the tight end position feels like it changes so much over time. From the very beginning, totally blocking to incorporated more as a pass catcher to we're just seeing an evolution at that position that feels really specific and clear to me in the last few years that we're going through an evolution here. Do you think that what we have long felt like we knew about tight ends is something that maybe we don't know anymore because we are now incorporating tight ends as pass catchers, like primary pass catchers in several offenses in a way that we haven't necessarily seen with the degree of frequency that we're seeing now historically?
So to put what you're saying differently of it changing, Quinn also deeply, deeply researches the college game as well. And a note that he brought to me was that he thinks that pass catchers' development is being helped by the proliferation of 7-on-7 at the high school level, where they're just getting more reps. And so at the tippy top level, the Brock Bowers level, the Sam Laporta level, I think you can have hard hitting tight ends at the tippy top of the league in terms of performance, in terms of NFL performance, to be particular, where these players are excellent wide receivers and they're used as excellent wide receivers, and maybe they're physical freaks who can line up in line and block a little bit. I think the tricky part becomes, it's called 7-on-7 because there's more wide receivers. Like there's typically going to be, you're not going to be running 12 personnel in 7-on-7 or 13 personnel in 7-on-7. And so wide receivers are just able to get more reps, and that is their specialty. And so I think that is kind of the reason why we see the shorter wide receiver curve at the top of the production curve. Tight ends be immensely productive in receiving, but then kind of the median tight end or the tight end 10 through 15 is just simply not as productive from a receiving level because they do have to lean on that blocking as well. And then
Right.
they can the receiving and the blocking can kind of come in years 4 and 5.
Okay. For year 5 guys, I think that maybe it's interesting that one of the names that jumped out at me when going through some of these stats that we've talked about, that he is a year 5 guy, and that's Juwan Jennings, who was one of the guys who I think, when we're looking at like, okay, these are the ones that we think are the most important and important for this conversation to be. Now I am looking for something a little bit different than what we've been laying out for you in this podcast, which is these stats are sticky year over year. You can expect these numbers to remain roughly the same. Okay. Now taking what we just discussed and looking at it through a different prism of sticky stats that also are predictive in terms of like when you're given an opportunity, what do you do with it? How good are you? Because we're looking for information about some of these wide receivers. You want to find under the radar guys. You want to find guys who are good but haven't had the opportunity to prove that they that they haven't had the opportunity to put up the high production numbers that we see with the top wide receivers in the league. And Juwan Jennings is a guy who I think might have a more opportunity this year in that San Francisco offense. And his numbers in some of these stats are like incredibly high. I think surprisingly high for people who are kind of vaguely paying attention. He had a 2.5 yards per route run, which was tied for 10th in the league last year. His target rate, he ranked 8th. So his target share is lower, but when he was on the field running routes, they targeted him at a rate that was the 8th best in the NFL. And then our receiving Sumer score, which is using tracking data, is 13th in the league, which like puts him in some very, very good company. What do you think all of this means for Juwan Jennings?
I think the case for the year 4, year 5 breakout guy is basically Juwan Jennings, and to a certain degree, T. Higgins as well, where it's like
he's already broken out
to a certain degree. Yeah. But point kind of being is like this person was a secondary receiver who, upon more information coming in or upon being healthy in terms of T. Higgins, is now basically looked at as the 1B or the 1A. In Juwan Jennings maybe could be looked at as a 1A as compared to Brandon Ayuk, who's now coming off of injury. That's the only reason why I say that. And it's clear they made an investment in him, extended him, and then Deebo Samuel is no longer part of the situation. And so I think that is the type of guy, archetype of the year 4, year 5 peak guy on average, where we have more information coming in about them. And all of a sudden they could really kind of break out because of the situation, the context, and because we see some of the usage from last year probably will carry over given his efficiency.
Before I get back to some of the other names that popped here, Asa Arnold has an interesting question about this conversation about years of when players break out. So if you could pop that up on the screen, there you go. Do you think age or NFL year is more indicative of when a player will break out? I know there's discussion on drafting younger players, but I'm curious how much that shifts the value curve. I think that that's an interesting question. Like, is it experience specifically in the NFL, or is it experience playing football, period, and at a certain age is like the sweet spot?
So let's kind of compare. I think the younger wide receivers typically will be the guys who are leaving early. And so there's a little bit of a selection bias in that, right? Like if you're a 19 or 20-year-old entering the NFL, that means you're really, really good and don't need more years in the NFL. It'll be interesting to see how this changes now that we're getting 25, 26-year-old rookie wide receivers. But in essence, I think it may be just more related to NFL year, given the way that the cap works and given the way that you're kind of forced in year 2 or year 3 to try to figure out who a guy is.
Okay. Interesting. I think it's a good question, Asa. Thank you so much for supporting the show. Another person that popped out at me in terms of some of these advanced stats that we have highlighted, well, in some of them, is Marvin Mims. So, and this wasn't like, although in some of these off the chart, it is off the charts, but I think we come up with an interesting story here looking into some of these Marvin Mims metrics. So he was 13th last year in targets per route run. Target rate wasn't targeted that much. Actually, the target number is 52 and he only ran 182 routes. So it's a small sample size, but when he was on the field and when he was targeted, right? Like, so when he was on the field, when he was running routes, he was targeted at a relatively high rate. Compared to the rest of the NFL. He was 4th in yards per route run with a 2.8 number, 4th in the NFL. Number 1 in yards after the catch over expected per catch, because now for somebody like him, we have to look at a per catch stat to tell us the story here, since we already know he doesn't have a ton of them. Number 1 in yards after the catch, period. 12.4 was his number. But his target share was 9%.
Right.
So I think he's a very interesting one. And this has been like in the fantasy community, this has been a story where I feel like on a week-to-week basis, there's a lot of complaining about Peyton's usage of him when some of these numbers point to, but he's so good. He's so good. Get him the ball more. Like, why aren't you getting the ball more? What do you think we need to look into further here?
Yeah, I think let's start with the stickiest stats, which is a low target share, especially from a coach who has had, one of the most productive wide receivers of all time in Michael Thomas, and one of the most productive over the course of the years in Marcus Colston and Jimmy Graham. I mean, like, the guy knows wide receiver talent. Sean Payton probably does. If there was someone I wanted to believe in the National Football League, it would probably be Sean Payton, given just the names that he's seen. And so you consider that it's fairly sticky that he's going to be used at a target share of about 7, 8, 9%. Well, what does that mean? Where is he being used? Well, he's being used on screens and gadget plays. Okay, well, that kind of explains to a certain degree the production after the catch. Because if they're screens and gadget plays, they're designed to either catch people off guard, or they're designed to be short and let him do his thing. So then, sure enough, again, a little smaller sample size. We're not talking about like the Jamar Chase 100 percentile here. But like last year, descriptively, he was very good, even when adjusting for all the context. In yards after catch over expected, he was excellent. But he was not excellent in route running. And so the kind of thought process here becomes Sean Payton knows he's dynamic, but he thinks he's only dynamic with the ball in his hands, or perhaps on deep balls as well, given his speed. So as a result, he's going to have either go balls or it's going to be screens and gadget plays. And so the thing to monitor for him this year to see if there is a boost in, his third year, he was drafted in 2023, is
target rate,
share. No, really
share.
both. Really both. He really
all of these
both.
Close stats and
yeah. target share. Targets per team target. If you really want to define it all the way. Because regardless of if his ADOT is great and his target share is high, if he somehow gets into that Debo zone or the DJ Moore zone to a certain degree as well, even though DJ Moore is a little bit more, useful after the catch, in terms of route running, then all of a sudden he becomes fantasy relevant. But he hasn't done that in the past 2 years, even though Sean Payton basically spent all of last year almost doing a bit of like, yeah, we're going to get Mims more involved this week. Right. And sure, he'd have some great plays, but he never really got massively involved as compared to the other wide receivers. So target share is the one to look at this year. And to a certain degree, if his ADOT goes up 2, 3, 4 yards, that could also indicate that he's going to be good as well. But I think he's going to be most effective on those screens, those gadget plays. And then if they start running more of those, especially with that offensive line that they have, which is very effective, all of a sudden he can become a fantasy relevant player. If you put me to it right now, I don't think that target share is going to change a lot. I think it's going to be 9 or 10% next year.
So I love this. This is perfect. This is exactly the type of conversation that I like, because you can find, he's a perfect example of like the numbers are out there, and I've fallen for that. I've done this. You can search my Twitter feed. I have been in the Mims camp, like going, use him. But this is the type of deep investigation about like why he might not be using him, right? And the route running grade going from 10th percentile his 2 years ago to 44th percentile last year shows improvement, but is still not good. Like
Right.
you don't want somebody whose route running is in the 44th percentile of the NFL. Like that would indicate that you're not actually a very good receiver. That's a huge part of receiving. So what's funny about this is that while I will raise my hand and put myself in this camp, we have complained about Peyton's usage of him. All of these numbers put together might actually be telling us that Peyton has used him perfectly.
Exactly.
Because he's maximizing the things that he does do well, so that he is number 1 in yards after the catch per catch, and so that he is 4th in yards per route run. Well, every time you run a route, I'm going to get you the ball in the perfect situation to maximize what you can do and not what you can't do. So, damn it, I hate that I'm wrong. I hate that I might have been wrong. Jury's still out, although it's pointing in that direction now.
Yeah.
But I kind of love that.
Yeah, and just to provide more kind of access, pull the curtain back. What generally goes into, a route running score? Is it accurately you run the assigned route, or how often you can get open using route running? We're judging this based on timing and based on our understanding. It's kind of the flip side of CPOE, right? Where it's like what you are trying to do in the context of the entire defense. What is the difference between the snap of the play and the time the quarterback throws the ball? And so kind of understanding those things gives us an idea of what the quarterback sees and what the quarterback is judging. And then if we're talking about a Sean Payton system with a rookie quarterback, it's what Sean Payton is seeing. Because we talked so much about how last year Bo Nix developed, even though he wasn't the most productive of all time and really kind of stuck his value in avoiding sacks. Sean Payton talked about how he developed the way he wanted him to, the way Peyton wanted him to. And so it's kind of a really good view of how the quarterbacks are viewing these players and how the coaches are viewing these players. And that's why we like to put it in this context. And it gives us a really good show of the reason why guys like Puka Nacua or AJ Brown are really so effective, because they're excellent in running those routes.
By the way, we should just tell you now, 3 names you're going to hear a lot from us between now and the start of the season: Puka, AJ,
100%.
Nico. Like
Definitely.
These 3, in terms of the statistical categories that we have said are important, they pop in all of them off the charts at the top consistently, those 3. And so much so, Sam, that like obviously Jamar and Justin, right? Like if you got a Jamar and Justin, this is a tier and they're like their own. They've consistently done it for a long time. Are we now getting to a point where we have more people in that tier? Like, or what would you do with the information that we have about Puka, AJ, and Nico?
I think the indication from our metrics and from the entire codex of the advanced metrics that we're looking at, especially in the fact that a lot of guys can get every single one, almost like Pokemon cards, indicates that the tier 1 of wide receivers is only separated by who is healthy during the year. And that there is a much larger tier 1, which includes guys like Jamar Chase, Justin Jefferson, CeeDee Lamb, Amon-Ra St. Brown, AJ Brown, Nico Collins, Puka Nacua. That's a massive tier 1 as compared to tier 1 of running backs, which I guess is like Saquon and Jahmyr Gibbs right now.
I don't know. I mean, I told you last week I have 6 in my tier 1 at running back.
So that's a good point. I will note.
But that's just me.
I'm talking about contracts in particular. I'm switching. I'm switching back to the team side.
Okay.
Like my point is that when Puka comes up for an extension, he should reset the market. Nico was an interesting one because, like Nico, they called it an excellent time.
Yeah.
Because they have him in this like interesting wide receiver 2 market that now has T. Higgins. But at the time, Tank Dell looked really great, and all these other players look really good. They traded for Stephon Diggs. And so he's interesting. But CeeDee Lamb was a guy who reset the market. Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase. So we may see the wide receiver market continue to get reset over and over and over again, because there's a possibility that this is an environmental thing. And that as a result of the way the wide receiver position is structured in the context of the aging curve, in the context of these statistics, in the context of 7-on-7 all the way down at the high school level and at the college level, that it's just a lot easier to be a wide receiver. Or let me back up. You can be an excellent wide receiver in context in the NFL, and that there can be 7, 8, 9, 10 of those guys rather than just the 2 that everyone thinks of right now.
It's wild to me to think that Puka might be the best wide receiver in the NFL. Like, I mean, in a conversation with certainly Justin Jefferson, Jamar Chase, but like, I'm just saying, like, one of them gets the top every year, right? Like, and I think Puka's in that conversation in a way where, like, we maybe are putting him in, like, narratively speaking, there's this, and then there's this, and he's like at the top of that tier 2. And I don't know that that's where he is. And it's so early in his career, and it kind of felt like it came out of nowhere, which I think makes it feel even more so like it's like, what's happening? And also the fact that he was in an offense with Cooper Kupp where it felt like it was a 1A, 1B, and then kind of became a little bit more clear that it was actually a 1 and then probably a 2. But I saw a clip, was it today or yesterday, of him working with Devontae Adams, and Devontae Adams kind of working with him on his releases, which is a rad clip if you're a Rams fan, to just be like, oh my God, like he could get even better and have access to this type of, veteran leadership that's there that can teach him certainly some things. But there's also a part of me that's like, that he could even get better, from what we've already seen, that there might even be still some stuff for him to learn. He's such an interesting wide receiver for me. I don't know. Yeah, he's fascinating.
I think if he has a fully healthy year in, I guess this will be year 3 for him, or year 3 for him, right? Or year 4?
3.
We could see a record-breaking year. Because you think of what Kupp was able to do in those years, and you think of how quick McVay was like, now Puka Nacua is the focus of the offense. And blending all those thoughts, higher level thoughts about usage, we could see a record-breaking year if he can remain healthy.
And even in terms of talent evaluation, I think it says a lot that McVay identified how good he was as quickly as he did. Like, it didn't take him a minute at all. Like, he was on the field for, mini camps and training camps. Like, that was the signal for me to draft him in his rookie year late. Obviously, I wasn't expecting him to have like a historic rookie season, but in fantasy, he was on my radar as like a guy that I definitely wanted late in drafts because of the way that Sean McVay talked about him. But it also says so much about his talent that like it was so easily identifiable right out of the gate. Didn't even require any kind of like transition period. He just hit the ground running.
Here's the cherry on top, given all the statistics that we've talked about. On SumerSports.com, you can go check this out. Target share leaders, 2022, number 2, Cooper Kupp, 30.91%.
Oh, 2022. Okay.
2022. 2023, rookie year, Puka Nacua, 10th, 28.830%. So automatically in year 1, he's one of the best, most efficient, and most used wide receivers. And that went up last year. It's probably going to go up again, frankly.
Well, yeah, it was number 1 last year. For Puka, right? Number 1 in target share.
Yeah. I mean, Puka was basically number 1 in everything. I mean, like, or at least top 5 in everything. Let's not.
Okay. Let's get back to a few of the people that are a little bit more like, are they good? Because these numbers are pointing in that direction. A name that popped that I thought was interesting, he just showed up higher in these categories than I would have expected him to, is Josh Downs, who is, and now we're not talking about like that Puka tier, like we're not talking about a tier like that, but we're talking much higher than I would have expected him to pop up. And that was, he's 20th in our receiving Sumer score. He's tied for 19th in yards per route run. He's 5th in targets per route run, 20th in target share. So like all of this is painting the picture. 20th in target share, like, means that they went to him with some degree of frequency. And we all kind of know what that offense looked like last year, right? It was like, obviously, there are some games when Anthony Richardson was on the field where you're going to push it downfield. And so Alec Pierce is going to get the ball more frequently versus when Anthony Richardson wasn't on the field, so to be 20th in target share under those circumstances in that offense where it felt like I don't know where the ball's going. I don't know what the offensive game plan is going to be this week. I don't know which wide receiver highlights the strengths of this week's quarterbacks best. The fact that he's top 20 in all of those categories, I think, is really interesting. So is Josh Downs good?
So I think we have to get a feel for how he's being used. And so, like, when it comes to these guys who have a ton of routes, it gets a little confusing. So, like, we're looking at average depth of target for Josh Downs, for example, 6.86. Like, Puka, for example, is not massively higher. He's about a yard higher. But it's still a pretty low one. So that does, just to get a sense, like, he's not going to get the ball super duper downfield a lot.
Mm-hmm.
And so then, like, let's just go a step further. We look at Josh Downs in terms of target share, 18th. So, still pretty much solidly in that wide receiver one view, yards per route run. So I think there's an argument that he could be a productive wide receiver. The question becomes the environment, like you said, Lindsay. It's like we've talked at length about the discussion between the quarterback and the wide receiver, who deserves more division of credit,
mm-hmm. or blame,
which you beat me to it, because I was just gonna say there's not a lot of credit to go around in the quarterbacks here. And so in the face of that, adding a guy like Tyler Warren into the mix, and then having Jonathan Taylor, who is a running back who, at least as it seems now, requires quite a bit of carry share, or will swing kind of the pass run differential. It just kind of builds a ceiling for him that is just not quite the same as a guy that probably has a similar profile, but has a different environment, like Amon-Ra St. Brown. And so then you want to dig deeply into the way that he, builds out in descriptively. And, he's good in route running. He's good in AI grade. It could set up for a breakout, but I want to see the environment. I think the holdback is the environment, as compared to some of these other places where the quarterback and the offensive line is really set.
So if he has a low ADOT,
mm-hmm. And it's not a killer low ADOT, particularly when you start filtering for guys who are running a ton of routes, 250. It's about 6.5 yards is about where he's at. 6.5, 7 yards. It is a little bit tied to the offense, but this is an offense with Andy Richardson where he's bombing the ball down the field quite a few times. So if he would play for the Lions, for example, who had a very low ADOT last year, I would be a little less worried. But it is a little worrisome in the course of that offense.
Yeah, I mean, I probably need to filter this a lot more in terms of routes run. Hold on, let me see, because I'm just looking at there are a number of guys who are double-digit ADOT guys. So just for perspective about like where the 6 lands, he's pretty far down that list. So then if he's good and he's the type of guy who is getting the ball on those types of plays, should he have a high yards after catch? Ideally, like, if he is good, should he be picking up yards after the catch to close the circle on this story?
That would be the hope. And so I mentioned Puka as a guy who has, a yak that is very similar to him. And we look at the difference between him and Puka in yards after catch over expected. Puka is nearly top 15. Josh Downs is not top 15. So that's where the differentiation starts to come. Exactly.
Yeah. Yeah. He's pretty far down the list of yards after the catch per catch. He's at 5.8. So that's, there's some good wide receivers that are in this range, certainly. Like, Devontae Adams is also 5'8", Nico Collins is 5'6", but I'm just saying, for the story we're specifically telling about what type of wide receiver he is, it feels like that number maybe should be a little bit higher.
I think my takeaway is we got to get Josh Downs to a better offense, man. We got to get him to the Lions or the Broncos. Come on, let's see what this guy can do.
That would be fascinating. Okay, is there anyone else that you want to highlight here? Ladd popped in a lot of things.
Yeah,
we're not breaking any news by saying Ladd is good, but maybe a little bit. Like, maybe he's better than we're giving him credit for all at this point in his career. Like, maybe he's better than we know.
I think when you look at his per reception, per target production last year. He was excellent, and it was an excellent draft pick. It paid off well. He did well in terms of the way he was running routes. He did well in the terms that he created with those routes. An interesting note to think about, though, is a little deep dive that I did on Quentin Johnson. And Quentin Johnson also ran pretty good routes, and he was targeted more as the year went on. He just wasn't catching the passes. That's last year, correct. And so the question becomes, will Ladd ever be, the superstar absolute guy in this offense? And I think that's a question that needs to be answered this year. I don't know if I am ready to, go out on a crazy limb on that. And you really just end up looking at target share, and he is 25%, which is where you want to see a rookie wide receiver, for example. If Tedoroa McMillan is in that zone this year for the Panthers, I'll be more than excited. Right. But then you look at Quentin Johnson also at 21%. And so it's like, if Ladd is that much more efficient than him, particularly at the ability at the catch and after the catch to a certain degree as well, we should start seeing that creep up into the high 20s a little bit more.
Do you still have that contested catch number in front of you?
I think Stopsky has the contested catch number for QJ.
But and for Ladd, it ends up being a QJ story.
Yeah.
But it was
it was like 60% for Ladd and 35% for
and
Quentin.
This is catch rate on contested targets.
Yeah.
Which is so funny, right? Because you think of who they are and who they're drafted to be. Quentin is supposed to be the contested catch guy. That's who he's, the big bodied. He's going to go win those 50-50 balls. And nope, it's Ladd.
Yeah, apparently no one told him that. So he doesn't. All right, goodbye.
Yeah. And just for context, in looking at next gen stats, tight window percentage, 4th best in the league, Ladd McConkey.
What? Yeah. What? But see, that, especially because we're surprised at that stat for his profile of wide receiver, that tells me he's good. That feels like if something can surprise me, I don't expect you to be good at this, and then you're good at that, and then you're also good at the things that I expect you to be good at, then that paints a picture to me of you're good. What's interesting to me is kind of what you were talking about. So 5th in yards per route run, 6th in receiving Sumer score. Those are insane. 6th in receiving Sumer score, your rookie season. That's wild. The company that he's in both of those categories,
right,
in these specific stories, is crazy. But then 31st in target share and 29th in target per route run. It's so interesting that he was doing so well and yet just wasn't utilized at the rate that you would expect somebody to be utilized if they're doing that well.
And I think this builds on to the story, Lindsay, which I think is probably my main takeaway from this exercise, is that the tiers of wide receivers are bigger than expected. There are more people in tier 1 and tier 2 and tier 3 than necessarily you would expect. And so you can probably get a lot of value if you're a fantasy player in round 2, depending on where you're selecting, of course. Mm-hmm. You could probably pick up a Puka and AJ Brown or someone like that in round 2, depending on how large your league is, and make out really, really well with a wide receiver 1. You could probably draft a Ladd McConkey or someone like that in round 3 or round 4 and make out with a wide receiver 1 or 2. And that, I think, is the true difference between the wide receiver class as it appears currently today versus the running backs in particular, where people may be reaching on running backs in the first round, and that might not actually be too terrible of a strategy, even though the correlation is not exactly the same, particularly if they have a receiving upside. And so I think the key to winning leagues this year is going to be how you play the wide receivers, given the idea that the tiers are a little bit bigger, and how you play the running backs, given that, we don't necessarily know how good some of these guys might be, but we do have an indication of how they may be in the receiving game.
Not to completely take this conversation off course, but I also am coming to the conclusion, and tight ends kind of fall under the pass catcher. Mm-hmm. We're specifically talking about wide receivers here today, but I think that there's a top tier of tight ends too.
Very much so.
And it's so clear who they are. and I want them. And tight end has always been a position where, like, yes, you can find somebody. Yes, somebody's going to emerge from this group, but good luck hitting, getting the dart to hit the right one. So if you're just taking shots later in the draft, like, you might end up having to stream tight end. So for me, this is a year maybe more than most, and you have to figure this out strategically in terms of your build and where you're going to make up for other things that you're going to miss out on by taking one of those tight ends. But we're not talking about a season where you've got like how it was a few years ago where Travis Kelce was going in the first round. Like, that's not what we're looking at. You're looking at like, late second, maybe in the third, taking one of those top tight ends. I just think there's such a difference between those guys and everyone else. So for me, I also kind of think that that's an interesting I look at those top tight ends as belonging in the wide receiver group. Now you go, I can wait on my tight end, but like, some of these tight ends are comparable to some of the top wide receivers. So if you look at it as that, and you're just kind of getting like, Brock Bowers is the same as wide receiver X in this range, well, like, go get him if he's going to put up points. Because the argument has been, historically, it's more that you would just pull that guy up because of scarcity. Well, like, yes, it's scarcity, but also they're producing like high-end wide receivers that you would take in that range. So it's not a trade-off to the degree that you would think.
Yeah, I think the delineation to make, and I think you make an excellent point, Lindsay, in that a lot of the predictability that we can draw from these receiving stats, talking about wide receivers, does map over to the tight end position. Mm-hmm. If you can get a tight end that can score like a wide receiver, given the positional scarcity and given that those players just don't score as many points as running backs and wide receivers, it may be worth it to reach up. And obviously those names are not anything new for the most part. It's George Kittle, it's Brock Bowers, it's probably Sam Laporta as well, if healthy. It's Trey McBride. That's probably
definitely Trey.
You can make a bet on guys like Mark Andrews, who had touchdowns were very much a part of his. You can make a bet on some of the older guys like Travis Kelce. You can make a bet on a guy like TJ Hawkinson. But there's really 4 guys, and probably 3. There are 3 guys, 1A and a second 1B in terms of Laporta, given the offense coordinator situation switching out a little bit. And that's Kittle, Bowers, McBride, Laporta, who probably can contribute like wide receivers, who a lot of these sticky stats will carry over for, and who can make a difference, given that you might be able to wait a little bit longer on wide receivers, given that tier 1 could be 6 guys instead of 3 guys, and tier 2 could be 8 guys instead of 4 guys.
All right, good stuff. So that's our sticky stats wide receiver episode. And the series continues. What's next, Sam? What should we do next?
I don't know. I mean, we kind of touched on tight ends here. I think a lot of it is covered. I think the things that I'm really fascinated about is offensive line, especially in the face of Frank Ragnow retiring, and my thoughts on potentially the Lions' regression on offensive line coming, though it is very similar to what the Eagles did last year, where Jason Kelce retired. They replaced their right guard almost in the exact same scenario that the Lions are now in. And given my 2 tackle thesis that I always talk about, if you have 2 good tackles, you should be a good team. But Decker's getting up there in age. I think offensive line is really tickling my mind, and so I'd be interested in some thoughts about that.
All right, let's get into some O-line stats. What might those be? Tune in next week to the SumerSports Show. Thank you so much for being with us today. Make sure to follow us on all the social channels, SumerSports, pretty much everywhere that you might be looking for us. And a lot of these videos or past videos from shows are up on the YouTube page also. I know that's not a place that we push you to all that frequently, but there's a lot of good content there. So thank you so much for being with us. We'll see you again next week.